I find it dismaying and objectionable that President Trump continues to deny the undeniable fact that Russia launched a major cyber attack against the United States, regardless of what party he launched it against.
That would be former U.S. Ambassador to NATO Nicholas Burns testifying last week on Capitol Hill. The former State Department spokesman and Harvard professor joins us now. Very good to have you on board, Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. Ambassador, what do we want to get out of the meeting today?
Well, I think President Trump has to, obviously it's the first meeting between them. He's got to take the measure of Putin. They've got to find a way to communicate, because there'll be crises and misunderstandings to come. So as any other U.S.-Russian summit like this, you've got to establish that channel of communication. But most of all, I think what Donald Trump needs to do is two things. He needs to back up the European Union on these continued sanctions against Ukraine, because we can't have a situation where we begin to ease the sanctions on Ukraine, on Russia over its annexation of Crimea and division of eastern Ukraine. And President Trump has mused about that possibility. And I certainly believe, for domestic reasons as well as foreign policy reasons, we have to sanction Russia over its interference in our elections. The Senate voted 97-2, but President Trump, it depends who you listen to. Is it the scripted Trump of the speech yesterday in Poland, where he criticized Russia, or the unscripted Trump?
I wanted to ask you about that speech. As former U.S. ambassador to NATO, what did you think of the Polish speech, which was well received in Poland? But how do you think it was received in Germany and among our other NATO allies?
It was a speech, Joe, designed for Poland. It struck the right notes about Polish history, the valor of the Poles, but it was also a dark speech. And you could see Steve Bannon's influence on it. There were veiled criticisms of big government, i.e. the European Union. There were more criticisms of NATO. And so a lot of criticism of NATO defense spending. And so I don't think it plays well in Western Europe, because in Western Europe, the idea of the West, and the President talked about defending the West, is open borders, meaning immigration, free trade, and you believe in alliances. And all, those weren't exactly the themes of President Trump in that speech yesterday.
So if President Trump does not bring up Russian meddling in the election in any way, in any serious way, is that dereliction of duty?
Oh, I believe it is. His first responsibility is to defend the country. What's more important than the sanctity of our elections? We know the Russians interfered. We know that they try to get into 21 databases in various states in the United States. And we know something about Putin. And that is, if you don't build a brick wall in front of him, he's going to keep going. And so we've got the 2018 midterms right in front of us, and the 2020 presidential. He has to raise this issue. You know, he doesn't have Republican support, as you know, in the Senate over this issue. They deserted him on this issue by proposing these strong sanctions against Russia.
Katty Kay.
Ambassador, we spoke yesterday about the speech in Poland. There's something else I wanted to ask you about, is that yesterday we saw the European Union and the Japanese sign a trade deal which accounts for something like 40% of global trade. The two countries noticeably absent from that trade deal, Great Britain, because we're pulling out of the European Union, and the United States. To what extent do you think, actually, you know, I think President Trump goes to Europe with a certain amount of disdain for Europe. But is America being squeezed out of deals around the world because of the president's withdrawing America from trade pacts, for example? And how much does that hurt America's security?
Well, I think the president and his team did feel that when they walked away from these big multilateral trade agreements, the TPP in Asia and the proposed US-EU free trade agreement, the Europeans and the Asians would have no alternative but to work with us on one-on-one trade agreements, and it hasn't turned out that way. In fact, you really see Merkel and Macron being a counterpoint to President Trump right now in Europe. They're opposing him on trade. They're opposing him certainly on climate change. They're not happy with his relatively, I would say, very weak policy towards Russia. And this is, Katty, for you and I, as a Brit and an American, for the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen London and Washington as the strongest poles in the West. No longer. It really is Paris and Berlin. And I really worry about American credibility in Europe for that reason.
Nick, it's Richard here. You know, what you just said is, you know, I think fairly frames the situation. What are your kind of hopes and fears going into these 24 hours coming out of the G7? What is it you'd like to see? What is it you're worried you're going to see?
Richard, I think it's, we're probably going to see a big difference of opinion on trade and steel and probably countersuits. But you and I have seen that for 30 years. That doesn't worry me. What worries me is that President Trump has consistently become kind of the critic of the major institutions of the West. I get the fact that the Europeans need to spend more in their defense. I spent time pleading with them to do that when I was ambassador to NATO. But you can't be a positive Reagan-esque leader if you're continually criticizing. And he found a lot of fault with the Europeans yesterday. And the same is true of the EU. And I think what really worries Angela Merkel in particular is that candidate Trump and President Trump has been a very consistent critic of the EU. These are the institutions of the West. We built the West on a unified Europe and on NATO. And he needs to lead those institutions. So a little bit of praise, a little bit of support, I think would go a long way here. Ambassador Burns, it's Willie Geist. Good to see you this morning. I want to ask you about something President Trump said yesterday during his joint press conference with Polish President Duda, and that is this question of unanimity among intel agencies, among the intel community, about whether or not Russia meddled in the election. October 7th of last year, the IC put out a statement saying, yes, we believe that Russia, in fact, did attempt at least to meddle or interfere in our election. President Trump yesterday said, actually, it was only about 3 or 4 agencies, and there was some dispute within the intel community. So just to clarify from where you're sitting, what is the position of the intel community on whether or not Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election? Well, as I listened to General Clapper, the NSA, CIA, and FBI authored that January 6th report that was issued publicly to the American people, but that all other intelligence agencies, the 14 others, all agreed with it. The FBI and CIA have been consistent about that over the last 6 months. There's no question about it. When you have a big 97-2 vote in the Senate, you rarely see that these days, on a bipartisan vote. When I testified, you could feel the opposition to what Russia has done. So I think it's a red herring to suggest that somehow there's division in the intelligence community.
Yeah, it's a red herring. David Ignatius is coming to you in a second. But first, Clint Watts, you talk about the 17 intel agencies. The DEA isn't going to come down. They're one of those 17. The DEA is not going to come down on it. The Coast Guard's not going to come down on it.
It's not their responsibility.
They're all. So if anybody's going, well, only 4 out of the 17 intel. No, it was the most relevant. It was the most relevant. The CIA, the FBI, NSA. The NSA, and
Yeah, that's why we have a collaborative group.
Right.
They lead on Russia intelligence. They all came to the same conclusion. They may pull from the other intelligence.
And the National Director of Intelligence. I mean,
and there was no dissent.
There was no dissent. The 4 that actually
this is the point.
Were germane to it. And so everybody writing on going, well, it was only 4 instead of 17. Yeah, if you would like, maybe some of the dogs could sniff something for the DEA, if that would make you feel better. Like,
and this is the trouble with Trump's
some of the
comments.
voting booths.
No one has ever offered another explanation for the hacking.
Right.
There's been no evidence for any other theory other than Russia.
Well, you said maybe a fat guy, right?
In Jersey.
His basement? And somebody in Jersey.
But that's an important clarification, because there is an argument. Yesterday all day you saw an argument that's saying it was fake news to suggest that there was a unanimous agreement among intel agencies.
Well, again, you go down the intel agencies, the ones that were actually relevant to figuring out whether Russia interfered were the ones that all weighed in saying yes.
David Ignatius.
David Ignatius has a question.
I want to ask Ambassador Burns a question. You rightly said, Nick, that it's crucial that Trump make clear his opposition, U.S. opposition to Russian meddling in our election. That said, do you think it's possible in this period of very bad U.S.-Russian relations for there to be some improvement? And would you like to see that?
Of course I would. I mean, we're the 2 most powerful countries in the world militarily. We've got to have the basis of a stable relationship. You want to see effective communications between the 2. And David, I'd say that we continue to basically agree with the Russians on the Iran nuclear deal. There are some differences on North Korea that have opened up, but I think that President Trump could probably close them with Putin. And you, David, you've been reporting brilliantly about Syria. I think there are a lot of landmines for us in working with the Russians on Syria, but we ought to explore the possibility of how we can at least try at some point to bring that war to a close to help the 12 million homeless there. You would have a view on that, but I think the president should explore that. We don't want to be aligned with Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. I'm not saying that. But if the United States and Russia can continue to talk about that, that's certainly in the interest of the United States. So this is not all bad news here. We ought to be looking for ways to cooperate with them.
Ambassador Nick Burns, thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
Thank
Have a great weekend.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.